Hi everyone, my name is Dan Chatham. I'm a former university admissions dean in the United States. I worked with several different universities for over 10 years. Today I would like to share with you some of the big differences between the US system and the Turkish system for university entrance. Specifically, today we're going to cover what American universities are looking for in admissions process. What do they look for in the applications for bachelor's degrees? Now this is very different system than many people are used to, particularly in countries where they have a national entry exam, countries like China or Turkey, for example. In the United States, universities are looking at test scores, of course, but they look at several other things, and I'll discuss those with you during this broadcast. First of all, let's talk about test scores. Tests are an important part of any university application. We can't deny that. It's true that they play an important part. However, they're not the only criteria. They are a part of a portfolio or a picture that describes the entire applicant. First of all, a university looks for test scores that are competitive with the typical candidate pool. If you look at a university, they will tell you what their average SAT scores are. The SAT is the name of the standard university admissions test that is used for admission into US universities. International students sometimes are exempt from taking the SAT, but not at all schools. Only a few schools waive that requirement. Now, the SAT scores that a school is looking for are published. It's easy to find this information. If you look for the university's name and then SAT average or average SAT scores, you'll find it quite easily. When looking at a university's test scores, obviously an average is not the only number to consider. Many schools publish the 25th percentile scores and the 75th percentile scores. These scores are particularly useful. If you look at a score and it is between the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile of the students admitted to a particular school, then that means that on the test score part of the application, this applicant is competitive. They may not be at the top of the class. Obviously, they're below the 75th percentile, so that means they're not in the top quarter of students enrolling in that particular school. But if a student has a test score above the 75th percentile for a particular university, then that student can feel very competitive. They may not be the top student. Indeed, we don't know what the top score in any particular school is, but they can feel that that particular part of their application is competitive, whether it's the SAT math section or the SAT verbal section. That's very important. Now, the second piece is to look at the bottom of the class. A lot of students really want to go to some of the schools that are famous and are well known globally. We all know those schools. We know those names. If you ask anybody, what's the best university in the world, you'll get a list that starts off with schools like this. Now, a student that is the top of their class from their home country may not be at the top of the class for these famous universities. So it's very important that a student look at the 25th percentile test score level in the particular school so that you can see, do I have the competitiveness to even get in? Now, sometimes a student will be right about the 25th percentile, and that's a risk factor. The student's application may not be considered very strong by the admissions committee if the scores are only at the 25th percentile. But does that mean that a student can't get in? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that 25% of the students actually enrolled in that school have a score below this level. When the applicant looks at their own test scores, it's easy to compare that number with the 25th percentile. And the more competitive the school, the higher these scores will be. So if a student does have a score at or around the 25th percentile, but not too far below, then they may have a chance of gaining admission to that school based on just that particular piece of the application. Now, it's important to remember that the rest of the application needs to be strong in order to offset this weakness. A 25th percentile test score is a weak test score compared to other students at that school. So it's really important to put this into perspective. Now let's talk about grades. Grades are the other academic measurement. You only have two measurements, two academic measurements. One is test scores, which we've just talked about, the SAT. The other is grades. I'll come back and talk about language tests in a moment. But the grades are very important. Schools do publish their average GPA of incoming students. Now, do you have to be an average student? No. You can be admitted with a below average GPA. How do you calculate your GPA? You may be from a country that uses a very different system, that doesn't use the 4.0 system. That's obviously an important part. So I would recommend that when you look at your grades, you go online and you look for international student grade conversion. You'll find some very useful information about how to approximate what grades you have from your home country and convert them into a 4.0 scale, which is used in the US. So looking back at the university, you'll see their average GPAs are published. Sometimes they may also publish the 25th and 75th percentile ranges, but that's fairly uncommon. So really the biggest number that you get is the average GPA. So how do you compare? If you have a GPA that's very low compared to their average, that's a warning sign. That's a risk factor. That tells us that there's a good chance on that particular item that you're not competitive. Obviously, to be competitive in any of these factors, you should be above average. If you want to be considered a competitive student, you should be above average on all of the different metrics a school is looking for. So if your GPA is low compared to their average, and for international students that's very common and very typical, you need to look at a couple of other factors. Do you go to a school in your country that is considered extremely competitive? Schools that are highly regarded globally? Schools that are famous for their rigorous engineering programs, for example, would qualify in this category. It's important that you be prepared to tell how difficult your school is, how difficult your high school curriculum is. Talk about the IB curriculum, or talk about it being a dual system where you're doing the international baccalaureate plus the national high school curriculum. You've got to really consider that. Talk about those issues. Be sure that you're ready to explain the difficulty you have or your challenge to the admissions committee. Now, this is especially true at the graduate level. So if you're doing a master's degree in the US, this is very much the same thing. Some of you will apply to US universities now for bachelor's degree and then not go because of finances or other reasons. So it's possible that later on in life you'll have this situation where you have to explain your performance in a high quality university from your home country that doesn't use the same grading system, and maybe your grades are a little bit lower than the average. So let's go back and talk for a moment about the English language tests. The two most common English language tests are the TOEFL and the IELTS. Now there's a third test also called the Pearson Test of Academic English. These are all fine tests. What I've heard from students is that they feel more comfortable with the IELTS exam than with the computer-based or internet-based TOEFL. This is not true for everybody, but the feedback I've received is this way. I know a little bit about the Pearson Test of Academic English is an excellent exam. In fact, when I was the Dean of Admissions for a graduate school in America, I used this test and brought it in for my university and approved its use. I think it's a great test, but not as many people have heard of it or are prepared to take it. It's actually a very good test for academic English. So regardless of the test that you're taking, you have to look at a couple of things in terms of your competitiveness. A university has a minimum TOEFL score that they will accept. However, the university's minimum sometimes is different than the minimum in a particular department or major. For example, a English language, English literature, or communications department may want to see a TOEFL score that's 5 or 10 points higher than the university's minimum. So just meeting the university's minimum does not represent the ability to get in. It represents the basic qualification necessary for consideration. It's critical that you look at that number and then see how far above it you are. If a student is very high above the minimum, that's great. There's no formula for this, but the higher, the better. So whatever the minimum is, that is considered just a minimum. You can't do a comparison like you can with the SAT. They don't publish the top 25%, the 75th percentile, or the 25th percentile. You don't get that information from universities. Okay, so on the academic side, we've talked about two major credentials. You have your test scores. These are the SATs. Now, we didn't talk about subject tests, but the SAT is actually broken into two components. There is an SAT general test, and there is an SAT subject test. The SAT subject tests are advanced level tests in specific subjects. This is an opportunity for students with advanced skills in these different areas to test at a high level. It's typical that a student who's part of an international baccalaureate high school program might be exposed to these SAT subject tests. Indeed, they're very difficult. Now, some schools do require SAT subject tests in addition to the SAT general test. When you look at the SAT requirements, be sure that you look for these subject tests as well. It's typical that the best universities will require 2 or 3 subject tests, and sometimes they specify what those subjects can be. For example, a famous school that we've all probably heard of requires 2 SAT subject tests. One of them must be math, but 2 of them cannot be math. There are 2 levels of SAT subject tests in math. So they specify that one must be math, but the other one must not also be math. That opens up the opportunity to take a test in chemistry, biology, history, or physics, for example. And other schools have strict requirements about all 3 of those tests. So be sure you look closely. So to wrap up on the academic side, as I said, we have the SAT test, general and subject. We have the language tests, IELTS, TOEFL, or Pearson Test of Academic English. And then we also have grades. Those documents, those scores, are all the admissions committee gets about your academics. Now let's look at another side. The admissions committee will ask you to write essays. The essay questions typically change from year to year, but they're frequently similar to a question about extracurricular activities, or leadership, or personal characteristics. Or sometimes they can be about challenges that a student has overcome. Now, not all universities require multiple essays, but many do. A lot of universities in the US use a system called the Common Application. And the Common Application has a set of essay questions that a student can choose from. In addition to this, some of the universities will require supplemental essays that are on a different topic that are given directly to the university. So you have to look carefully, but this essay area is very important. It highlights for the universities, in many cases, your leadership or personal characteristics. It definitely highlights your extracurricular activities, and it absolutely highlights your ability to communicate effectively in English. Your essays need to be well written, well thought out, and concisely communicate what you want to say. Frequently, these essays are not very long, just 250 to 500 words, but sometimes they can be considerably more, like maybe 1,000 words. Take a close look at the essay questions and think clearly about what you want to say. Okay. Another part of the application is references. Reference letters are important for admission. This is an opportunity for you to get the opinion of somebody like your high school teachers or your high school guidance counselor or somebody else that knows you in a personal capacity that's not a relative. They never want references, personal references that are from relatives. That's not acceptable. But what you can get are references from organizations where you may have volunteered, places where you might have worked in a part-time job. You can get references from your teachers at school. And each one of these references can be used in a slightly different way. You can ask your reference providers to comment more heavily about your academic abilities, if that's a section of the application that needs more support. And you can ask your reference providers to comment more heavily about your leadership or personal characteristics, if that part of your application needs to be stronger. Reference letters typically are given by the reference provider directly to the university, and they never come through the applicant's hands. They're done online, usually. Now, the next thing that a school will be looking at is a set of characteristics. Most U.S. universities look for things, personal characteristics and personal traits like leadership, communication skills, problem solving, teamwork. These characteristics may or may not be common where you're from, but they're very important to U.S. universities, especially the more competitive schools. The more competitive the university is, the more they're looking for things like leadership and excellence in your extracurricular activities. So these characteristics need to be part of your essay. They need to be part of your commentary or your introduction of who you are to the university. Extracurricular activities are very important. They can be the basis for your essays frequently, and oftentimes, whether you're writing about the extracurriculars or about your leadership in the organization, they are critical because that is your biggest outside of school or extracurricular, as they say, extracurricular activity. Most of the time, university applicants haven't had much in the way of part-time jobs. They haven't had much in the way of extra activities that could give them an opportunity to show leadership. So these extracurricular activities are where that happens. Some of you may be saying, what is an extracurricular activity? An extracurricular activity is something like a school club. It might be private activities like your hobbies, a student who pursues playing a musical instrument, or a student who runs or participates in an athletic team on a competitive level. That's considered an extracurricular activity. And a student has an opportunity to do two things in all of these extracurricular activities. They can both show expertise and they can show leadership. Depending on what kind of activity it is, you have more opportunity to show one or the other. It's kind of hard to show leadership when your hobby is playing piano. On the other hand, it is easy to show expertise. So things like having public concerts or participating in public performances, that's how you can show expertise in music or singing, dance, any kind of performing art. In athletics, it's easier usually to show leadership as well as excellence, because most of the time there are team leader positions, team captain roles that a student might have participated in. Okay, so the universities are looking for a balance. They want academic excellence on the one hand so that they can show a student can succeed in the university. They want the best students possible to come to their school. But on the other hand, they're looking at a student's extracurricular activities and their personal characteristics. And this is not something that's measured by a test. It's not something that's easy to look at and compare with what the typical student profile looks like. However, if you read the university websites, the admissions pages, you will learn a little bit about what the university is looking for. They may say that the majority of our students have been student team captains in high school. They have been the editor of their school newspaper, or they may have been performers in school performances. Read the university websites and you'll learn about these things. In the process of applying to American universities, you need to present a balanced portfolio. It has to be academically qualified and appropriate on the extracurricular activities. If you can succeed in doing that, then you or your student will have an excellent opportunity to enroll at very good universities in the United States. As I've helped many university applicants with their applications to dozens of universities across the United States, it's clear that a lot of times students get caught up in focusing on the test scores or the grades, and they forget that it's a balanced portfolio approach. So remember that. A student who is now in the 11th grade or 10th grade has an opportunity to continue building extracurricular activities, to continue striving for leadership positions, to continue developing expertise and excellence in their hobbies, whether it's music, athletics, languages, any of that. They have an opportunity to continue or to start doing volunteer work, to perform charity work, or to give back in some way to the community. All of these kinds of things matter, and they're very important on university applications. So if I could leave you with one piece of advice, it would be to encourage your student, or for you to continue pursuing extracurricular activities with a high level of excellence or leadership in them. Pursue those things, and then be ready to discuss them when you're applying to U.S. universities.